The Lewiston-Clarkston area of northern Idaho is generally a quiet area. It attracts hunters, fishermen, campers, and tourists looking for an escape. It's certainly not an area known for its criminal activity, but between 1979 and 1982, 5 people vanished from towns across the Idaho-Washington border. When bodies began to surface, it's clear that the otherwise peaceful area may have just become the hunting grounds for a serial killer. Disappearance of Christina White. Situated along the Snake River, Assatton, Washington is known for its natural beauty and landscape. In 1979, it was known for being a safe place to settle down. Quaint and quiet, it was the kind of small community where everybody knew everybody and bad things didn't happen. That was soon to change. In 1979, Christina Lee White was just 12 years old when on April 28, 1979, she attended the Assatton County Fair with a friend. It was a particularly hot day that day, and despite all the games, rides, and fair foods at her disposal, Christina was growing bored and uncomfortable in the heat. She decided to leave the fair and go to a friend's house. It was around 2:30 p.m. when Christina called her mother from her friend's house to let her know that she was feeling sick from the heat. Christina's mother didn't have access to a car and told Christina to put a wet towel on her neck and lie down and rest. She told her to come home when she felt better. But tragically, Christina would never make it home. Christina's mother never heard back from her daughter, but assumed that she had gone back to the fair. When Christina left her friend's house to go home, she was riding a 10-speed bicycle. It had a basket in front and 3-inch nuts on the front wheels. The bicycle was brand new, and it had been Christina's birthday present just weeks earlier. She was last seen on the 500 block of 2nd Street sometime between 7 and 10 p.m. When Christina's mother went to pick her up, she was nowhere to be found. Classmates said she had been on her way home the last time they'd seen her. Within weeks of her tragic disappearance, Christina's school papers were found scattered and fluttering in the breeze at a farm on the outskirts of Assatton. Neither Christina nor the bicycle she was riding the day of her disappearance has ever been found. The community believes Christina's sudden disappearance is a one-time tragedy, that is, until another girl goes missing. Murder of Kristen David. In 1981, Kristen Noel David was a 22-year-old student at the University of Idaho, where she was pursuing a double major in broadcast journalism and political science. On June 26, 1981, Kristen was seen riding her bicycle from Moscow, Idaho, south on the U.S. Highway 95 to Lewiston, Idaho. A witness believes he saw Kristen that night along the same highway outside of the town of Genesee. He claimed that he considered stopping after seeing what was presumably Kristen on the road with her bicycle strewn about. A man driving a brown van approached her as if to help. The witness contemplated getting out of his car to help, but continued on his drive. When he got home, however, he did call the police to report what he had seen. However, when police arrived at the scene, Kristen, her bicycle, and the man in the brown van had vanished. Initially, police were sure the man had either made it up or made a mistake, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Kristen was described as a loving and responsible young woman, so when she didn't show up for work, her family was immediately concerned. They quickly reported her missing, but the answers to her whereabouts would come a week later, and it wasn't good news. On July 4, 1981, a fisherman was out on Snake River when a black garbage bag washed up on shore. The fisherman opened up the garbage bag to find local newspapers wrapped around an unknown object. When he peels away the newspapers, he is horrified by what he finds: a woman's body. When police arrive on scene, they discover that the fisherman's findings isn't an entire body, it's just a body part, and the victim, Kristen David, had been dismembered. The following day, some of the remaining bones were discovered somewhere down the river in 5 more garbage bags. Kristen's bicycle and personal belongings were never found. 2 girls riding their bicycles home disappear from the same area. It was possible it was nothing more than sheer coincidence, but as investigators started to put the pieces together, they found it likely that these 2 cases were linked, and they wouldn't be the last. 3 murders in one night. On the evening of September 12, 1982, 21-year-old Christina Nelson and her 18-year-old stepsister, Jacqueline Brandy Miller, were spending time at home in Lewiston, Idaho, when they decided to run some errands. They left a note behind for their parents, letting them know they've gone to the shops and will be back soon, but the girls never returned. They vanished on their way walking to a grocery store downtown. Interestingly, a man they both knew would also disappear that very same night. 35-year-old Stephen Pearsall was described as a homebody and talented artist who specialized in drawing cartoon characters. The night of September 12th, Stephen got a ride to Lewiston Civic Theater, where he worked as a janitor. He wanted to use the laundry machines and practice his clarinet. That was the last time anyone has seen or heard from Stephen. The people that knew him found it strange that he would never leave his clarinet behind at the theater, or that he would leave an uncashed paycheck at his apartment and his car at his friend's house, suggesting that Stephen's disappearance wasn't voluntary. Stephen was like a big brother to Christina and Brandy. In fact, Christina had worked at the theater as a janitor before she quit, and Stephen took over her position. It was how they were all acquainted. Christina and Brandy continued to frequent the theater, and it became almost like a hangout spot for them. Christina and Stephen were also both students at Lewis and Clark State College. All three disappeared on the same night, but only two would be found. On March 19, 1982, 18 months after they were reported missing, Christina and Brandy's bodies were discovered in a rural area 35 miles from Lewiston. Investigators were unable to determine the cause of death for Christina, but were able to conclude that Brandy had been murdered. Because of their close ties and coincidentally timed disappearances, investigators first looked at the possibility that Stephen could have been the one who murdered the two girls before fleeing. But as investigators started to paint a picture of what could have happened that night, their suspicions of Stephen's involvement diminished. They now believe that it's likely that all three had been in or near the theater at the time of the disappearances, and that they were probably victims of the same killer. Hunt for a serial killer. The Lewis-Clark Valley had a reputation for being a charming and safe place to live for all families. But as investigators begin to unspool the tangled web of disappearances and murders, it becomes clear to the community that no one is safe. Mothers stop allowing their children to ride their bicycles outside alone, and young women choose to stay indoors when the sun goes down because now it seems that these disappearances and murders are all connected. A list of suspects began to emerge. Then, investigators received something shocking. A confession. Otis Toole was born on March 5, 1947 in Jacksonville, Florida. His childhood was plagued by severe abuse. His alcoholic father abandoned him, and his mother was abusive. Toole began experiencing abuse at the hands of relatives and acquaintances at a very young age. This abuse would impact and change his psyche permanently. He had a mild intellectual disability with an IQ of 75. He also experienced grand mal seizures. Toole would often run away from home and sleep in abandoned houses. By the age of 10, he knew he was gay and would go on to have countless sexual relationships with men. When he was 14, he committed his first murder after he ran over a salesman with his car. He would eventually meet serial killer Henry Lee Lucas and would claim to have accompanied him in 108 murders. One of the murders was that of Adam Walsh. While Toole was in prison for other unrelated murders, he confessed to the 1981 killing of 6-year-old Adam. A few weeks after his confession, police announced that they had lost evidence. Following the murder of his son, Adam's father, John Walsh, would become a well-known victims' rights advocate and television host of America's Most Wanted. Despite lack of forensic evidence, John believed Toole was Adam's killer, and in 2008, without physical or DNA evidence, police announced Otis Toole to be Adam Walsh's murderer. So, when Otis Toole takes credit for the Lewis-Clark murders, it isn't so far-fetched. He was a drifter and a convicted killer, but Otis Toole was also known for falsely confessing to dozens of murder cases, and in 2009, a police detective who interviewed him stated that he had ruled him out as a suspect. Prime suspect. In 1995, Lewiston police announced that Christina, Brandy, and Stephen were all murdered together inside the Lewiston Civic Theater by another unnamed theater employee. It wouldn't be until 2011 when the then unnamed suspect was revealed to be Lance Jeffrey Voss. The Lewiston police weren't the only ones who had Voss on their radar. In 1998, authorities from Spokane, Washington were investigating murders that would eventually be attributed to serial killer Robert Lee Yates. But in the process of investigating the murders, ended up interviewing Voss as a potential suspect. Lance Jeffrey Voss was born November 15, 1947 in Chicago, Illinois. He served in the Navy from 1965 to 1968. During this time, the ship docked in ports in California, Washington, Hawaii, and Hong Kong. He would eventually be discharged from the Navy in July of 1968. According to police reports, at 25 years old, Voss was caught and arrested for attempting to break into a mortuary in California. On June 5, 1972, a neighbor called the police to report suspicious activity outside the mortuary chapel. When police arrived, they found Lance Voss equipped with concerning objects: a flashlight, a knife, and a camera. A recently removed window screen was also found leaning against the building. Just prior to his attempted break-in, 17-year-old Antoinette had a heated argument with her boyfriend. She stormed off and walked down to the beach where she disappeared. The next day, her body was found floating near the shore. Her death would be ruled as a suicide by drowning, and her remains were taken to the same mortuary Voss would later try to get into. Though it's not clear why Voss was trying to break into the mortuary, there were the remains of Antoinette and one other recently deceased teenage girl. Some might brush this off as morbid curiosity, and while disturbing, it certainly wouldn't make him a killer. But what sets Voss apart from the other potential suspects is his direct connections to the victims, connections that are too alarming to ignore. Before 12-year-old Christina White vanished, she visited the home on 502 2nd Street in Assateague. It was the home where her friend lived and where she stopped by to cool off from the heat. That home belonged to Patricia Brennan, the girlfriend and future wife of Lance Jeffrey Voss. Police have said that Christina's friend was in the backyard when Christina arrived and had no contact with her, and that it was Voss who gave Christina a wet cloth to help her cool down. There's no way to say for sure whether Voss left the home with Christina or not, but Voss did display behavior that is typical for serial killers after the fact. One is the need to insert themselves into the very crimes they committed. Police and family recall Voss showing up to the organized search parties for Christina. They also recall his unsettling enthusiasm about helping with the criminal investigation by offering suggestions to where they should search. His suggestions typically moved away from the areas investigators were sure could provide clues to Christina's whereabouts. Voss's personal connections didn't stop with Christina. It was at some point revealed that Kristen David, the University of Idaho student, had been employed at the Lewiston Civic Theater for a short time. This is crucial information because it links her murder directly to the murders of Christina and Brady, and the presumed murder of Stephen. Lance Jeffrey Voss had also apparently worked at the Lewiston Civic Theater, which means not only did he have access, he knew the victims in some capacity. The night that the three went missing, Voss was at the theater and claims to have seen Stephen Pearsall that same night. He had worked with him all day building a ship prop for an upcoming show. According to Voss, he said that Stephen left the theater around 9 p.m. to go to a party, and that Voss himself had left shortly after to have dinner at a pizza place. Voss told law enforcement that he returned to the theater after dinner and slept from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. the next morning. Despite the heavy door leading into the building and police sure that the three victims went inside at some point that night, it's hard to believe that he would have slept through the noise. While the circumstantial evidence seems to be damning, little progress has been made on the cases. At one point in the investigation, Voss was asked to take a polygraph test. He refused on the alleged suggestion from his lawyer to not speak with authorities. Police did note that the voice stress analysis conducted on Voss during the questioning showed some signs of deception. In 1963, an 8-year-old girl named Diane Taylor disappeared on the way from her apartment to the YMCA in Chicago, Illinois. She was brutally stabbed. Voss had apparently attended high school in Chicago and worked as a youth counselor at the YMCA. He was 15 at the time and interviewed by police. Lance Jeffrey Voss goes under the name Jeff now and has since moved to North Carolina. Without the proper physical evidence linking him to the crimes, it seems unlikely that he will be charged with the murders. Gloria Boberts, the cousin of Christina Nelson, began investigating her murder all on her own in 2007. Impacted by the loss of her cousin who she admired, Gloria has poured her efforts into trying to find answers for her cousin and for the other victims in the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. A retired FBI profiler, Bradley Garrett, who looked into the case, believes it's possible that Kristen David was murdered by a different killer because of her dismembered body, which is unusual even among serial killers. While there are no definitive answers, the Lewis-Clark Valley murders changed the community. It is unsettling to know that whoever was responsible for these brutal killings continues to roam free. But the families of the victims hadn't given up hope that one day all of their questions will be answered and, more importantly, justice will be served.